reminded me that we're talking about that I was assigned to speak this morning, and she said, the last time you spoke on Mother's Day, you talked about death. And I realized from that Doug apparently is afraid of the mothers of the congregation, because every time Mother's Day rolls around, he skips out of town and leaves me to do the preaching. I don't know what y'all did, but please don't do it to me. And we got to talking about what was the sermon going to be on, and I don't know if this shocks anyone. I'm a bit of a procrastinator. Amy will tell you that. And so I was thinking about, as we drove back from out of town yesterday, what I was going to speak on this morning. And I decided that I would talk about the terrible mothers in the Bible. And, there's plenty of those. There's the woman who they were in the famine in Jerusalem, and so she ate her child and then was upset because the other mother wouldn't eat their child. There were the two mothers who brought the child before Solomon to be divided, and so on and so forth. And then I got to thinking, no, that's probably a little too negative for Mother's Day. But one of the cool things about the Bible is that it is full of real people. If you look at Greek mythology, it's full of fake stories of people. It's something that someone has made up. The fairy tales that we tell our children, Cinderella and whatever else, those are stories that have a purpose. They have usually some kind of a moral to them to try to teach. But the Bible is full of real people. And this morning, I'd like to look at some of the real mothers of the Bible. A few examples of motherhood in the Bible, but we're not just going to look at the good ones. And we're not going to look at the ones you probably think I'm going to talk about. We're not going to talk about Mary, the mother of Christ. We're not going to talk about Eve, the very first mother. We're not going to talk about those, not because they're not worth talking about, because they are, but because I think there are some really, really instructive illustrations or instructive examples that we can see from some mothers that don't get a lot of pages devoted to them. But I think there's some very instructive things that we can see about them. And the first one I'd like to talk about is Rebecca. And I realize that's really small, and I apologize. I can't even read it from back here, so good luck to y'all. If you would please read with me in Genesis chapter 25. Turn back there, and let's look at Rebecca. Now, Rebecca is in the lineage of the Old Testament patriarchs, and we think of Rebecca as being a good mother and things like that, but I want to look at maybe some problems she had as a mother. I'm not saying she wasn't a good woman. I'm not saying she wasn't an important character in the Bible story, but I would like to look at a little bit about her history and some of the mothering that she does, and see if maybe there's some lessons we can learn from there. Now, Rebecca, of course, is mentioned in here, Genesis chapter 25, and beginning in verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padanaram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. There's a whole story, of course, about how he came to take her as a wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah and his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, what is happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." And when her days to birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. And afterward his brother came out with him, his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. And when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Do you see a problem? Perhaps in the family brewing. So in her family, Rebekah doesn't share the love or the affection equally with her children. I'm not going to tell you which of my children is the favorite, because they're here and listening. Sometimes I'll joke with them, and one of them I ask, well, why does she get to do this and I don't? Or why does he get that and I don't? And I say, well, it's because we love him more. Or because we love her more. Just to mess with them, and that's probably going to be brought up in therapy one day. But the idea is that when you have children, something that is so critical to the love of a child and the life of a child is its relationship with its mother. And I can't help but wonder that, did this impact Esau? Did this impact the way that Esau turned out as an individual? That his brother was always the favored one by his mother? Yes, Esau had his father, and that's great. But we see Esau make some terrible decisions later on in his life. We see him with a terrible attitude. In fact, even in the New Testament, it's mentioned that Esau was foolish in giving away his birthright, and he regretted it. And I'm not saying that she caused him to make those decisions or he's not responsible for him, but it's very obvious that there was some division in the family, and this division comes to a head in Genesis chapter 27. Let's go over there. And if we want to talk about Rebekah in a light of probably not a good example of a mother. We won't read the whole thing just because of the length of it. But in Genesis chapter 27, Isaac is an old man. His vision has failed, and he is now prepared to give a blessing to his children. First to his oldest son, Esau, and then he intends to give another blessing to his younger son, Jacob. And notice here the role that she plays in this. Genesis chapter 27, begin reading with me there. And of course, in verse 1, when Isaac was old, his eyes were dim, so he could not see. He called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. He said, here I am. He said, behold, I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Take your weapons, your quiver, and go hunt for me. Bring me something. Now, verse 5, Rebekah hears this conversation. Could you imagine your mother hearing a conversation between you and your father and immediately scheming with your other siblings so that you could be shortchanged in this relationship or in this blessing that you were to be received? But Rebekah was listening to when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and so on and so forth. And she says, go to the flock, verse 9, and bring me 2 good young goats. And verse 10, and so you shall bring it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies. And Jacob says to his mother, that's not going to work. Esau's hairy and I'm not. And so what does she do? Well, his mother said in verse 13, let the curse be on me, my son, only obey my voice and go bring them to me. And so, of course, he does this. And you know the story. You see, if nothing else, if we look at this as a lesson to be learned, yes, she helped in the deception of her husband, Isaac. She took advantage of an old man. She listened into a conversation that it was fine, I'm sure, for her to hear, but she took the information she knew and she used it for her own selfish gain, for the benefit of her favorite son. If there's a lesson in this for mothers, it is that we cannot let the love that we have for our children, you cannot let, I can't say we, I'm not a mother. You cannot let the love and the affection that you have for that son, in this case Jacob, do things that are wrong and that are evil. And this was wrong. I have no doubt that she didn't do it because she was selfish. I don't get the impression she was being selfish. I don't get the impression that she was trying to get something for herself. She was legitimately trying to help her son Jacob. But she'd been about it the wrong way. And there's a lesson in that. And then let's talk about someone who's even worse. Now I know we pick on Rebekah, and I don't want you to think her whole life was full of evil and wickedness. I'm sure there was a lot of really good things there. And if there's a lesson in that for us, it's that mothers make some mistakes and even out of the best intentions do things that are wrong. but they do a lot of good as well. But then there is Athaliah. She's a sweetheart. Any single guys in the crowd, if you're looking for a good mate, don't pick this lady. All right? We don't hear much about her. She's not a real famous character in the Old Testament stories that we tell our children, but she's she's just a perfect example of what not to be as a mother. Turn with me, if you would, to 2 Chronicles chapter 22. 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Now, she is in Judah. And, of course, the kingdom has been divided, and if you know a little bit of that history, 2 Chronicles chapter 22, you know that it was not a great time. It was essentially, in Judah, one terrible king after another, and lots of intrigue and lots of failure. Ahab and his crew, and Ahab has this wife named Jezebel. She was a sweetheart as well. And Athaliah follows in her footsteps. But you want to see a really sad passage? Let me show you a sad passage. In 2 Chronicles chapter 22 and verse 1. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, this was the son who had been Jehoram, who had died, if you will. Makes his youngest son, the king. And so king in his place, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had killed the older son. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. Not a long-term king. But you know, this is a sad one here. He reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. Verse 2. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. And he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. His mother. If anybody ought to be able to go to anybody for sound counsel, no matter what age they are, no matter what position they are, there ought to be at least one person in your life who will give you the best advice that they can think to give you, and who will be honest with you, and who will try to do what is best for you, and your mother. And this guy's mother led him away from God. She was mentioned specifically as this key counselor to him in leading not only his own family, not only himself, not only doing the evil things that he did, but the whole nation with which he had been trusted by these men to lead. His mother leads him in the way of wickedness, and it's not too difficult to figure out why. We can keep reading in this story down to verse 10. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, of course he dies very soon, she arose and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. She murdered her own family. Do you not understand what that means? That's her grandchildren. Anybody who would be a threat to her consolidation of power, and she does consolidate power, and only one escapes, and later on she is killed outside of the temple. But this was a woman who was so selfish that she was willing to give wicked and evil advice to her son, the king, and then when he dies, instead of mourning his death, she goes and she perpetrates murder on her own family. If there's anybody who we can look at it, we can say, that's terrible. That's a terrible example of a mother. It's her. And the lesson in there for mothers, and for those of us who have mothers, is not, don't kill your family or whatever. But the lesson is this. Mothers are not exempt from selfishness just because they're mothers. And selfishness is the cause of so much evil and so much pain and so much destruction, not on the scale of this lady and her family, for most of us. And this isn't just mothers, this is everybody. But selfishness can be such a thing to be guarded against. And the good news is, I'm convinced most mothers aren't selfish. Most mothers are more like a Rebecca. They give selflessly, and we'll talk about a mother who does exactly that in just a minute. But selfishness is such a dangerous thing for the human soul, for the human condition. And there's no better example of that than Adaliah. And then, turn with me to Mark chapter 6. I promise this won't be the most depressing story about mothers. But in Mark chapter 6, we meet Herodias, another sweetheart. She's in a family. Now, if you're interested in the history of the Herodian dynasty, it's fascinating. There's lots of killing, and there's lots of betrayal, and there's all kinds of stuff like that. And Herodias is a woman who is she's very much involved in that. In fact, she's living in an adulterous relationship with her husband Philip. And to sort of set the story, John the Baptist goes up and confronts her about this, and Philip as well, and says, you shouldn't be doing this. You ever heard that phrase, hell hath no fury like what? A woman scorned? I'm pretty sure Herodias was probably the one in mind for whoever came up for that with that statement. Because this is a woman who holds a grudge. She holds a grudge. And in Mark chapter 6, and Herod, again, he's not angry at John the Baptist. In fact, we find it in verse 20. He liked to hear John the Baptist. He was happy to hear from him and listen to him. But verse 21, an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. Now, the preceding verses talk about this grudge and this bitterness and resentment that Herodias, this mother, holds against John the Baptist for pointing out her sin. And so this young woman, presumably, she dances, she pleases Herod the king and all of his court. And so she goes back to her mother. And she asks her mother. Now, let me just make it clear. What was offered to her as an opportunity was tremendous. It could mean wealth. It could mean influence. It could mean power. It could mean security for her family. This mother has this opportunity to ask for this thing that she knows she can leverage to get up to half of his kingdom. And she uses it for what? For spite, for vengeance. Look what she asks. What should I ask? She says in verse 24. Asked her mother. And she said, the head of John the Baptist. And she came immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so, verse 28, he does this. And she takes it to her mother. This woman leveraged, presumably, the sexual attractiveness of her daughter to execute vengeance upon somebody who had simply pointed out her sin. Now, I don't know if she got a Mother's Day card or not, but that's a terrible mother. That's a horrible mother. You see, it's not just selfishness that is for her. I'm sure that's a part of it. But this holding of resentment and jealousy or envy or whatever it is, there are so many times that this can be mothers as well. You see, the woman knew she was doing wrong, no doubt, or felt that she was and had been pointed out and was offended by that, and her response was to leverage her child. And what causes a person to do that, I don't know exactly. But what we do see is she took her evil life and drug her child into it. It makes me so very sad to see news from the time some child that was shot in some drive-by shooting or drug gone bad. It makes me so sad because I think, what why was that child even there? Child even in the car? Why was that child even in that home? If you're going to do wicked. That's your choice. You face the consequences. Don't bring your children into it. That's what this woman did. So these are all negative ideas. So I say all these things so mothers, today you can take comfort in the fact that you're not nearly as bad as any of these. And I mean that. Sometimes I think mothers take a lot on themselves. They tend to put a lot of weight on their hearts. Am I doing the right thing? Am I raising my children the right way? Am I doing all I'm supposed to do? And if anything, I hope you see that there are some terrible mothers out there, and you are not the worst. Let's talk about some of the best. Hagar. Back in Genesis chapter 16, turn with me. Hagar is one of those people who shows up in the Old Testament. And I don't know that we ever really give Hagar a whole lot of time or a whole lot of thought, but Hagar is the handmaiden of Sarah. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the story of Hagar. She is not given a choice, presumably, whether or not she wants to be with Abraham to bring up offspring on behalf of Sarah, her master. She is a slave. She's a servant. But she does that, and of course she becomes pregnant very soon, and of course that stirs up the fires of jealousy within her master. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, so it may be that I obtain children by her. And so Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, she took Hagar, and I'm paraphrasing. And verse 4, he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abraham, May the wrong done to me be done to me on you. I have gave you my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you. But Abraham said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. So then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. You know, I think there's a lot of folks who could identify with Hagar here. Hagar didn't make this situation for herself. We don't know how she ended up being the servant. We don't know all that story, but all this, Hagar is stuck in a situation in which her master, her mistress is dealing harshly with her. No doubt this lasts for some significant period of time, so much that she finally just flees. And Hagar is out here in the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord found her in verse 7 by a spring of water and says essentially this: return to your mistress and submit to her. And goes back, and then the angel of the Lord gives her this promise about her son, and he would be a father of a great nation. That basically that she would be taken care of, the child would be taken care of. And so what does she do? She packs up her toys and she goes home. She goes back to him, back to this situation that was no doubt harsh every day. She was willing to put herself into that situation because she had faith in God, that even though it was a situation she didn't ask for, she didn't get into because she wanted to, so far as we can tell, she hadn't done anything wrong here. She had just done what she was told to do. And lo and behold, she goes back. And so she does. And this goes on for some time. And then, of course, Isaac is born. I'm fast forwarding quite a bit. Isaac is born. And now it's even worse. Isaac is born to Sarah at the time. And this friction starts up again because now we have two sons. Which one's going to be the heir? So on and so forth. And so she is cast out by Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham sends her out, gives her a little water, her child, and they depart and they go into the wilderness of Beersheba. This is Genesis 21, verse 15. The water of the skin was gone. She put the child under one of the bushes. She went down and sit him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, Let me not look at the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God talked to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." And then God opened her eyes and showed her a well of water and so on and so forth. And they ended up doing fine. I think a lot of mothers can identify with Hagar. Life has thrown her quite a few curveballs. And she's just about the point of giving up. And she's just sitting there, "I'm not going to watch the boy die. I'm going to sit over here and just let him die. I don't want to watch that. Nothing I can do about it." When you get older and you become an adult and you become a father or a mother yourself, sometimes you become a little bit more aware of what it means to raise a child as a mother. And you become a little bit more cognizant of the struggles and the despair that often comes with that struggle. Because when you're a child, you don't often see it. But as an adult, you do. And just like God took care of little baby Esau and his struggling mother, Hagar, He'll do the same for you, moms. Even though it may not always be easy, and even though the circumstances you find yourself in are not your doings. Let's go and look at another mother who was blessed by God. 1 Samuel chapter 1. I find it very interesting that 1 Samuel chapter 1, we are introduced to Hannah. Hannah is married to a man who has another wife, and this other wife has lots of children, and of course this puts Hannah in a precarious situation because she has no children, and so she goes up to goes to her husband and talks about this despair that she has. She can't be a mother. It's not working. She's barren. And so she goes up to the priest, to Eli, and she offers to God this promise. And I'm paraphrasing. You can read for yourself 1 Samuel chapter 1, which if Samuel wrote it, I believe he did, it's biographical from Samuel's standpoint. And she goes to God and she essentially promises that she will devote that child to God. She will give that child to God if she is able to conceive. And lo and behold, she is. And then she goes on to wean this child and then gives him up over to the devoted to the service of God in Eli's house. She does exactly that. Now, I don't know about you. I have some toys in my life. I have some guns, hope that doesn't scare anybody, that are really fun to play with. I have a motorcycle that I've managed not to kill myself on yet. I have a home that's very comfortable. I have all kinds of things that are very precious to me. And I'd give all those up if I needed to. It wouldn't be the end of the world. Wouldn't lose too much sleep over them. But you ask me to give up a kid? A child? That's a big ask. And I would venture to say that mothers are probably even more so like that. Ask me to give up anything, that's fine. I'll go without, I'll do without. I'm always amazed by reading stories about women in the Depression who, they would go without so that their children could have food. They would cook a meal and not eat any of it because they knew their children needed the food worse than they did. Mothers will sacrifice, mothers will give, but to ask to give up that child? Hannah did that. Hannah made a promise to God, and even though that promise was hard to do, to complete, she did it. We'll talk about Hannah in just a minute, but a little bit more and how she feels about doing that. But I want you to notice here that she makes this commitment to God and then is willing to give up the most precious thing, no doubt. Remember, this child was not something that was bought on a whim. It wasn't an impulsive thing that she just had this child, Samuel. This was something she desperately and deeply wanted, that was important to her to have this child. She finally gets this child, and then she gives him over to the service of God because she knew that's what she needed to do, and she knew that he would be a great man in God's service. And then there's Eunice. Very similar to this situation. Eunice is mentioned not by name but by description in Acts chapter 16. She is the mother of Timothy. Acts chapter 16. She's the mother of Timothy, and Timothy has a great name even before Paul really meets with him, it seems. And this is Acts chapter 16, verse 1. Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. And Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, so he took circumcised Jews who were in those places. For they all knew that his father was a Greek. And this is sort of a small mentioning here, but in 2 Timothy chapter 1, we get a little bit better picture of this woman Eunice. 2 Timothy chapter 1, there's a mentioning of her and some interesting things that we see there. So Timothy is a young man who's well spoken. His reputation precedes him, if you will. And his reputation is somewhat built on the fact that he is the son of a Jewish woman and a Greek father. Presumably his father is not a believer, is not a Christian. But his reputation precedes him amongst the brethren. And I want you to notice here, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. Notice what Paul says about this. He says, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. You see, what made Eunice so impressive to me and interesting to me, she's only mentioned a couple of little snippets. But notice that Eunice listened to her mother. The admonishments in the New Testament, some of which are in Timothy, or the writing of Paul to Timothy specifically, some into Titus, is that these older women are to train the younger women, and the younger women are to learn from their children, to teach their children. The older women are to teach the younger women to raise their children and to do all of these things. And notice here that Eunice leveraged that family that she had. She leveraged her own mother. She listened, she grew up. We don't see a rebellion. We see her following in the footsteps of faith of her own mother, and then taking that and translating that to the life of Timothy. And Timothy is in a very interesting place. He's probably the one critical person who can reach this group of people who's struggling so much with this question about, what do I do if I'm Jewish and I become a Christian, or I'm Greek and I become a Christian? Here's Timothy at this critical crossroads of the burgeoning kingdom of Christ. And it's his mama who prepared him for it. You see, there's nothing you can raise a child who is the best at baseball or soccer or FFA or bull riding or whatever it is that you choose to get your kids involved in. That's great, moms. But be like Eunice. Translate that to your children, what it means to be a Christian. And that doesn't mean just dragging them to services. It means having a sincere faith and sharing that faith with those children. You have no idea where that will lead in that child's life. You have no idea. You don't have a crystal ball that you can predict the future of where that work that you put into those children is going to end up. I have no doubt that Eunice had no idea that 2,000 years later we would be reading a letter written to son by an apostle of Christ. She had no idea some guy was doing that on Mother's Day 2021. But here we are. And the letters that Paul wrote to Timothy and the good work that Timothy did still shows in the church that exists even to this day. Eunice doesn't get a lot of credit, nor does her mother Lois. I'm completely leaving her out of the picture. But it's such a critical thing. It's such an important thing. So finally, I want to go back and look at 2 Samuel chapter 2 to close our thoughts this morning. And I appreciate you being patient. 2 Samuel chapter 2. I thought I would close not on words of 1 Samuel chapter 2. I apologize. Samuel was an old man by the time 2 Samuel was written. So Hannah goes and at the end of chapter 1, she brings Hannah and Elkanah, her husband, they bring Samuel up and they give him to Eli, the priest, so that he can serve. And you can read a little bit in that context there and see that Eli's sons were pretty awful. So really, the future of the spiritual leadership of Israel really does lay on the shoulders of this young child that's being taken up there. And I thought the words that Hannah says, if we're going to have words that are inspirational to mothers, or if we're going to have words that help those of us who have mothers to think upon them, blessing that they are, I want you to notice that Hannah's prayer, as it's written here, doesn't talk about mothers that much. Hannah looks to God. And she moves that focus from her and herself and her struggles and what she's given out, and she looks to God. I hope you will do the same morning. Yes, think of your mother, call her if she's still, or go eat dinner with her or whatever it is to do. I bought mine a knife. It's cool. Do whatever you need to do today. But I hope that you will, just as this great mother Hannah does, that you will take this opportunity to turn your focus upon Christ, upon God. Read with me, if you would, her prayer here. This is 1 Samuel chapter 2. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in the Lord. My mouth hides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked ones shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed." I hope you'll take those words from a godly mother with you this week. I don't know whether you had a good mom or a terrible one. I don't know if she'd fit more in the first half or the second half of this lesson today. My gut feeling is probably more second half than first. But I hope you'll look to her and you will thank her and you will thank God for the blessing that she was in your life, or is in your life, if you're still blessed enough to have her with you. And I hope that you will take the advice of this good mother, Hannah, as you live your life and as you submit yourself to Christ. If we can help you in any way to do and to accomplish just that, please let your need be known as we stand